Howdy, all you delicious people. The Last Man on Earth, Season 4, Episode 7 through 13. Uh, Thank you guys for otherwise watching the last review. If you came from that one and come here, I really appreciate it. I just find this show to just, there's parts of it that I'm finding just freaking hilarious. And there's also some parts where I'm just kind of like, yeah, why did we go this route? Why did we go on this journey? And plus, I'm also asking in my head, where is Pamela and Glenn? Where are they? Like, were we meant to just eventually find these characters dead in a bed somewhere? Because I'm assessing or assuming that we're going to have some kind of justification for these characters at some point, especially if this is the last season. I think that also we end up having it to where reasonably we are starting to see the consistent pattern emerging, and it kind of feels like ultimately when we are to add yet another character into this show, we're immediately just like, okay, how long is this one going to last? How long is it before this person is going to have to forcibly get killed somehow, either by accident or by somebody ending up having to kill them or whatever? Like, even to this point, where they are basically making a joke about it in the show, basically having a person um, making it seem like they're going to die just to throw people off, just to make it a joke, which I found freaking hilarious. Uh, Going into here, I thought that this show is making it seem like you should be on your toes. That quite possibly somebody could wake up one day and a character that you loved is now gone. Like, for example, like if everyone loved Todd, then all of a sudden maybe a character would come into the fray to ultimately make Todd dead, which is sad. Which ultimately I don't want to happen. I'm just making an example of something. Um, but going on into this episode, I thought that this episode was so, or these episodes, I mean, were like, there are times when I think that they are trying some things new, which I can applaud them about. But again, it's always like they take the joke and make it a hill to die on kind of thing, where they just keep uh, beating that joke down to it being a metaphorical horse of sorts, and to where it's just like, man, I can't wait till they come up with a new thing. The closure, closure, closure. That song, okay, you've kind of went to that well far too often. Change it up a little bit. Shift it to where ultimately people are going to think that that closure moment is coming and it never comes. That would be hilarious. Ultimately, have it to where now you've used so many staples in here that you can now shift it and tweak it to ultimately you could have it to where Phil ultimately is giving people what they think that they are going to be expect and ultimately turn it on their heads. I think that they deliver one part of that in these episodes, and I loved it. But then, in all actuality, there's a lot of stuff where ultimately I was like, man, this show is starting to almost get predictable. Like, it's starting to be to the point of like, okay, well, I'm seeing this thing in this person's hand, so definitely this is going to go down like this. And surefire enough, kaplooey, it does. Trying to say this as much as possible in a very cryptic-like sense, but ultimately, for people who have seen the show, you'll know exactly what I mean. So let's go into that spoiler time to ultimately crack down, to ultimately go into these shows and ultimately review it. Episodes 7 through 13. Reasonably, there's one thing that kind of bugged me about this show, and we'll talk about it in here. We ultimately have a new character to be added, that is to otherwise be a character that is keeping people on their toes within these episodes, but really this character is to bring something new to the table, but it's not something that is really like, man, I really enjoy this. I really enjoy these episodes compared to anything that happened earlier. Like, nothing is making me go. Nothing is making me go into these new episodes and not having me consistently reflect on the past and how great the past episodes were. Whereas, like, these episodes are just kind of like, yeah, I can see that this show is getting very complex. Bravo to that. But let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil these episodes. I just went into a bizarre route for that one because F it. So, episode 7, we end up having it to ultimately Tandy is ultimately going and now realizing once he is to go and talk to all the gals that it seems that ultimately he comes to them and ultimately calls them all, hey guys, how's it going? And we end up having to where the girls are starting to say, well, numbers game is telling us that there's a lot more women than there is men. So how about you actually call us girls for once? And so Tandy's like, you know what? You are completely right. We end up having to where consistently Tandy is trying to adjust to seem much more appropriate. And we end up having it to ultimately, yeah, a lot of people are getting annoyed by it, but they're also kind of applauding Tandy consistently. So, I don't know, every little thing that Phil ends up doing ultimately just it annoys people, but then it also is, so it's like a good and bad situation where a lot of people are ultimately just impressed by Tandy, but they're also annoyed by it. It's like basically consider this. So we end up having it to where a guy chops down a tree, and ultimately a lot of people could be like, man, like, that chainsaw sound is so annoying, and it's really been going on for a very long time now. But that tree, when eventually it gets knocked down, ultimately is having the ability to have me be able to see more sun. So ultimately, I think that kind of metaphor is kind of what Phil or Tandy is, really. It's like, hey, wait for that chainsaw sound to go off, for that tree to go down, for eventually you to get that sun, is basically what kind of Phil or Tandy delivers with this show. So we end up having to where Tandy ultimately completely switches up every word that he's ever said to ultimately, instead of saying agreement, he's ended up saying agreement. Woman. To ultimately try and adjust every single word in his vocabulary to adjust for a female component, which I thought was really interesting. I thought that was kind of fun, and I ultimately was like, man, that's going to make his scripts a lot more difficult for Phil to memorize because he has to adjust every single word to adjust to a female kind of approach, which I thought was interesting. So we end up having it to where in this very episode, we end up also having Todd, who is desperately clinging on to want to be some mentor for either some child, some kid, or whatever. And so we end up having it to where Todd is desperately clinging on to Erica's child to spend time with it. And we end up having it to where ultimately Todd is to go and sleep next to Melissa, and Melissa realizes, like, hey, like, do you have a little baby powder on your shoulder there? And ultimately Todd's like, oh no, I had cocaine. And Melissa's like, yeah, you a liar. And ultimately Todd's like, oh no, I had a lot of cocaine, believe me, I had tons and tons of cocaine. I was like, yeah. I was like, we end up having it to where Melissa ultimately has it to where she is starting to realize how baby fever has kind of really consumed Todd. So we end up having it to where Todd in this entire episode is trying to do some parenting to Jasper because it seems that ultimately Todd is starting to realize that maybe Todd and Jasper could either be best friends or Todd could mentor Jasper. So we end up having it to where Todd is really trying to spend as much time as humanly possible with Jasper, ultimately going when Erica and Gail are having a wedding together, because ultimately Gail was very hesitant about doing this whole wedding thing. But eventually we end up having to where Gail is looking at Erica and she's like, well, there's only one girl that I want to be in this world with, and that is you. So, because we end up having it to where Gail is really just spending a lot of time with Erica, basically having a ladies' night out, or just like, it seems like those two are perfect for one another, and so they are going to cement that by having a wedding. Which ultimately, the entire time, Phil is ultimately really driving home within this wedding that there are two women being married together. Ultimately, trying to really say it's like, well, hey, like, this was an oddity before, but now it's the normal. It's like, yeah, so what? Whoever wants to get married is whoever wants to get married. It's amazing. So we end up having it to where Todd is eventually going to this wedding, and he wanted Jasper to wear the exact same suit as Todd. And ultimately, Jasper comes in wearing a Hulk costume, and ultimately Todd is livid. Ultimately, just like, hey man, I look ridiculous out there. Like, I thought we were gonna both look the exact same. Like, you know how humiliating I look now wearing this suit, and you're not wearing this suit. And so we end up having to eventually, Jasper is towards the tail end of the episode, eventually go and one, learn how to shave from Jasper, or Jasper is to learn how to shave from Todd, because Todd is bizarrely having Jasper shave Todd's back, and ultimately, we end up having it to where also Todd is asking Jasper, has he ever learned how to tie a tie? And of course, by the end of this episode, we end up having it to where Todd ends up trying to tie Jasper's tie. And yeah, so because we end up having it to where ultimately Todd is trying to discipline Jasper at some point, because we end up finding out that Jasper is driving away with this giraffe in this limousine, and ultimately we end up having it consistently where Jasper is doing all kinds of stuff that isn't proper for his age, but F it, like, he's the only kid left in the world, right? There is no law, there is no rules, with the exception of what this group will ultimately say are rules, or say are laws. And so we end up having it to where Todd goes to Phil to ultimately say, hey man, like, it doesn't really seem like Jasper is listening to me. Like, what should I do to ultimately figure out a way to discipline this kid? And we end up having it to where Phil ultimately says, like, well, you gotta really get in his face. You gotta really, like, I've been a dad for I don't know how many days now, and I think that I can help you. And so we end up having it to ultimately, Todd ultimately is the Jasper and Phil is the Todd. And so we end up having it to where Phil ultimately says, like, well, hey, like, I would really like a cookie. And ultimately Phil ultimately goes into this dark, deep down place where ultimately is basically like telling Jasper, it's like, well, you're never gonna get a cookie. And all these like really dark and brooding like stuff where ultimately you would never tell a kid all of this stuff. And then we end up having it to where Jasper, or to where Phil is ultimately telling like how hard it is being a dad and all these kinds of things. like how hard his life is, and like how like raising a child is so difficult, and all these things, and this and that, to ultimately get it to where like Jasper is the Jasper character is, I guess, supposed to feel bad for his father, uh, who is actually Todd, um, and so on and so forth. And then we end up having to where ultimately Phil ultimately says like, oh, okay, well, is that good enough? And ultimately Todd is like, yeah, I think you went a little bit too far there. And ultimately Phil is just like, nah, oh, okay, well, it ends up being what it is. So we end up having it to where eventually Todd is to run off. He is to eventually run off to go to this jail, and we end up having it to, or seemingly to, a jail. But we end up finding out that Melissa ultimately has been able to track Jasper down and figure out exactly where he is. But Melissa is not telling the rest of the group where he is. But we end up having it to where the entire group, we end up having it to where Phil and Todd end up going to this prison to accidentally unlock a guy named Carl from this prison. Supposedly he is a security guard, and but the actual story is actually going to be completely said here. So we end up having it to ultimately, this guy is ultimately named Carl. What ended up happening is that this guy had eventually started eating people. And so he ended up, what ended up happening is that he ends up painting people's portraits and then stabbing them and or killing them, and then eating them afterwards. Like basically to have someone consistently uh, driven to his home uh, to ultimately kill them off to eat them. We eventually find out that seemingly Carl is at this dinner with this girl, and every little bit of thing that he's saying to this girl is otherwise completely and utterly disgusting. And so we end up having to where Carl ends up going like, "Hey, have you ever been painted?" We end up having it to where this girl tries as much as humanly possible to make up a phone call. Like, "Hey, yeah, oh, my dog is sick? Oh, well, I really need to leave this date then." We end up finding out that this date ultimately is making up this whole entire story so she can leave. And we end up having it to where Carl doesn't have a painted person for him to eventually kill. But eventually we get it to where Carl eventually goes and finds a man to paint. And all while that is going on, we eventually see Carl in some segments where ultimately he is kind of doing his day-to-day stuff, and he's microwaving a human head, or ultimately having a head in his freezer, or stuff along those lines. So while we end up having it to where Carl is preparing for eventually this guy's death by getting a knife to go and stab this guy while this guy is not paying attention, we end up having it to where the innocent bystander is opening up the fridge to go and get some kind of cola or some kind of drink of sorts, and he ends up finding a human head in the fridge, and he runs off. Carl ends up realizing that ultimately the fridge is open, and ultimately the jig is up on Carl. And so we end up having it to where ultimately Carl is to eventually get arrested, and he is ultimately to go into prison and paint people. Still not painting very well, but ultimately we end up having it to where consistently I think Carl is still trying to eventually paint people to eventually kill them afterwards. Um, we eventually have it to where seemingly the guy that otherwise Carl is to be painting in prison eventually passes or falls over, ultimately in a bloody mess, and that causes basically a number of police officers to run to this prisoner to ultimately collect him. And then we eventually find out that this entire prison eventually is dropping like flies, one by one, eventually prisoners are starting to die. It seems like the only two that are ending up being left is a prison guard and, of course, Carl. So it seems that ultimately this prison guard and Carl end up spending a lot of time together. We end up finding out why this prison guard is consistently at this prison, and it seems that the prison guard ultimately mentions is like, well, hey, this is just my job. It's like, well, you're no longer getting paid for it. Nobody's giving you a check to do this. Like, why are you still here? But we end up having it to where this prison guard is to eventually go and try to leave this prison and ultimately tell Carl, it's like, hey, man, I'm going to give you enough food for 2 months, and then ultimately I'm going to give you a noose just in case you want to just do yourself in at any point in time. And so Carl ultimately says, like, well, hey, man, before you end up leaving, can I shake your hand? And, of course, the security guard does so. And so we end up having it to where Carl grabs the guy, shoves him into the bars to ultimately stab him to, of course, kill him. And then we end up having to where Carl ends up going and getting the keys off of this guy. But justifiably, these keys, I guess, do not unlock anything to get Carl past any part of him getting out of this prison. And so we end up having it to where Carl is trying to escape and finding out or trying to figure out any number of ways that he can escape out of here by like stacking a bunch of chairs against this barbed wire fence to ultimately think that he could possibly get out via those means. We end up having it to where Carl is trying a random number of combinations to a numbered thing to ultimately see if that will ultimately get him out of this prison, and ultimately the electricity shuts off to where ultimately Carl can't go and get this combination and figure it out. So we end up having it to where Phil is to ultimately Phil and Todd are to otherwise unlock this guy from this prison to have him come with them, because ultimately he's wearing a security guard outfit. They aren't thinking that ultimately he is a prisoner. They're thinking that he's some security guard. So we end up having it to ultimately everybody's like, oh my god, yet another person. And ultimately we end up having it to where Carl is trying to convince people that ultimately he's a good person, ultimately mentioning about the like he's switching roles. He's basically being he's ultimately saying that his backstory is that ultimately he is the security guard and ultimately not the cannibalistic criminal and so on and so forth. So he's basically retelling his story as the viewpoint of the security guard, and we end up having it to ultimately the people are kind of concerned about, like, well, hey, like, if there's a cannibal out in the loose, like, shouldn't we be concerned? So we end up having it to ultimately that Carl is consistently mentioning that he is getting he had gotten a plethora of different kind of nicknames that had accumulated over time. And so we end up having it to where ultimately everybody's like, well, didn't you just say that you were a so-and-so person? And ultimately Carl is like, well, no, like that was just another nickname that I had gotten. Like there's about 5 or 6 nicknames that this guy had ultimately mentioned in a repetitious way. And people are just starting to get a little baffled or confused by this. And so we end up having it to ultimately Carl is consistently asking people, like, hey, would you like to get painted? Hey, would you like to get painted? Because we end up having to where Carl is supposedly mentioning that he thinks that he's kind of been able to fight back this whole cannibalism thing, and that ultimately he won't need to do it anymore. But we'll just see. We'll just see about that. So we end up having it to ultimately Carl is to ultimately mention to Gail, hey, would you like to get painted? Because ultimately Gail is mentioning how Carl had mentioned that he's a painter, and Gale wants to see how good Carl is at painting, because eventually Carl eventually lies about being a really good piano player as well um, with Phil. Ultimately, we end up having it to where uh, Carl goes into some rendition of some song, and ultimately it is played quite awfully. But I thought that was hilarious. Like, I recently had seen the guy that plays Carl. I recently had seen him also in Man Seeking Woman, where ultimately he played Jesus. Um, and so immediately I was like, man, like I've kind of like seen this guy kind of everywhere, and it seems usually when um, any kind of Saturday Night Live character is kind of tied to a show, so is also this guy, which otherwise is just like, F it. Like, if he keeps getting paychecks, like, who cares what he does, kind of thing. Um, so we end up having it to ultimately, Gail ends up mentioning about her burning her finger, and we end up having it to where Carl mentions, like, well, hey, like, put ice on it, because ultimately, ice will ultimately help a burn. Like, I know fairly well from how many times I've seen burnt flesh, and kind of like Gail was like, what? Like, what? And ultimately he's like, yeah, like ultimately I know an uncle who was at a burn firm, and I was like, what? So we end up having it to ultimately, you not, we end up having it to eventually Gail ends up taking off this bandage that had a little blood on it, and we end up having it to where Carl desperately is going after that band-aid in that trash, which ultimately makes me a little makes me a little queasy even thinking about it. So we end up having it to ultimately Carl is going and wanting to steal that trash, and Phil catches him on it. Ultimately, like, hey, what are you doing with the trash? And ultimately, Carl is ultimately mentioning like, hey, man, like the trash needs to be emptied, you know. And so we end up having to where Phil ends up turning around to ultimately eventually turn back around to eventually see Carl eventually drinking tea with the band-aid in it, and I'm so grossed out at this point. And so we end up having it to ultimately Tandy is to go to the group and ultimately say, hey, there's something wrong with this guy. There is something really wrong with this guy. I'm very uneasy with this guy being around here. There's something about him. The group is ultimately just like, well, no, I think we just need to get to know him more. I think we need to just, I think we really need to just kind of like give him some time and see what happens. But we end up having it to where Phil ultimately goes to Todd and ultimately says, "Hey, man, like how about you go and enjoy my brand new meal that I've concocted?" And ultimately Todd's like, "Sure, I'll go along with it." So we end up having it to where Phil ends up making an entire plate of band-aids that ultimately um, has Tandy's blood all over it, and Tandy is just starting to eat these band-aids. And again, I am sick of thinking of that, because it's just like we end up having to also. I think that Carol in this episode makes this random bag of every single food that ultimately Jasper loves to otherwise appeal to Jasper at some point within these episodes, and I'll get to that. So we end up having to ultimately Tandy tells Todd about the band-aids, and ultimately now Todd is on Tandy's side, and ultimately he's like, hey, I'm convinced. So now we are starting to have it to where ultimately Tandy and Todd are to follow Carl, because Carl ultimately goes out to a graveyard to go and steal some flesh off of a graveyard character. And so when Carl comes back, we end up having it to where Todd and Tandy ultimately ask Todd, "Hey, buddy, Todd and Tandy ask Carl where he's been. Ultimately, just like, hey, man, I saw you at the graveyard. What were you doing?" And ultimately, Carl ultimately was like, well, like I wanted to get out there to just have some solace and just to try to like center myself. And we end up having to where Todd and Tandy are like, oh well, yeah, well I also saw you like unbury a man and eat him. And ultimately, Carl's like, well, you know what? Like, I think it's about time that I confess that ultimately, yes, I am a cannibalist. And so we end up having it to where Carl's ultimately saying, you know what, there is some kind of like back and forth about me considering wanting to eat you all, but then again, I'm not sure. So I think it's about time that eventually I want to like maybe even try giving you guys a little nibble at some point. And so we end up having to where Carl is ultimately making people very uncomfortable, having everyone on edge, and like people are starting to maybe like secure their rooms or stuff away from Carl, and it's kind of hilarious. So we eventually have it to where the entire group utterly decides to say, like, you know what, like Carl, I think your time is done here. So they take Carl back to the prison to ultimately try and leave him there, but they eventually find out they didn't actually quite properly lock the prison all that well. So Carl ends up just coming back to just say, "Hey guys, like I missed you, and you know what? I just wanted to come back to say hi, like hey man, like I know like you guys don't want me here, but I just want to be here." And so they end up trying to relock Carl up yet again. Told me just decide, like, you know what, I think it's about time we just kill him. So we end up having to where they have to draw a straw to kill Carl. And so we end up in like the funny thing was when Carl was ultimately going and eating the skin off of somebody in the graveyard, we ended up having both Todd and Tandy both barfing away, and we end up having it to where Tandy was telling Todd, "Could you barf quieter?" like, or he's gonna hear us. I thought that was hilarious. So, and here's also the thing: when Carl was to be introduced to the group, here's the funniest thing of these episodes. So when Carl was introduced to the group the very first time, we end up having it to where Tandy ends up lighting him up with bullets. Um, and then Carl is to fall over. And then eventually we end up having it to where Tandy ends up mentioning, hey guys, they're all blanks. So we end up having it to where ultimately the stereotype that ultimately as soon as someone is introduced into the fray, they are going to get killed off is kind of cementingly just like, hey, we're going to make a joke out of this now. To ultimately have someone take an entire time to have a backstory to kill them off right away, which this time that does not happen. So we end up having it to ultimately Tandy is going to have to forcibly draw the shortest straw, technically, because Carol actually drew the shortest straw. And I'm gonna pause here for a second. Okay. Ultimately, we have it to where Tandy is drawing a short straw to ultimately lead him to be forced to kill Carl. We ultimately have it to where at the same time Carl is ultimately holding the Rubik's cube, and I'm immediately just like, okay, well, of course he is. I'm like, so what's gonna happen is Tandy is going and ultimately going to shoot and or fire, and before that happens, we're gonna end up having to where Carl solves this Rubik's cube and detonates the bomb. So they set up this whole Rubik's Cube thing just for it to be killed by a brand new character. What was the point of that? I did not understand that one lick or bit or whatever. Um, yeah, it was just ultimately we ended up having to ultimately some people were trying to solve the Rubik's cube at some point in time. Phil was trying to solve it, ultimately getting the advice of Todd, and so now we end up having it to where Carl ends up solving the Rubik's cube to end up detonating the bomb to kill Carl, and so we end up having it to where Phil now has to go and justify Carl's death to people as if he had ultimately done a practice shot of sorts, which ultimately ricocheted, or maybe his gun went off by accident, or something along those lines. To ultimately have it to where seemingly they had built two coffins for Carl. One half of it was his leg half, and the other half of it was like the entire juices and whatever that ultimately had been left of Carl, and ultimately they had really ended up having it where Phil ends up going and does this speech for Carl, and Gail ultimately ends up giving him praise of just going like, you know what, like, if anything, we completely misjudged you, Tandy. Like, you know what? We thought this Carl guy was a stand up guy, and you otherwise opened our eyes to really tell us the truth. And we end up having to her all the times where ultimately Gail would ultimately give Phil crap. This is the one time where ultimately she really did praise him, and ultimately Phil otherwise was going to do an entire speech right after this about how he saved everybody and how he was right and whatever, but he ends up just tearing up the speech to not have to be like grandiose about the whole thing, and so on and so forth. So we end up having it ultimately within here. We end up having it to where Todd is to eventually want to have a kid. And so we end up having it to where Melissa ultimately finally consents that it's like, well, hey, Todd, how about we have a kid somehow? Not for me, not putting a bun in my oven, but ultimately, how about we try and ultimately ask Erica if she would like to deliver another kid for us? And so we end up having it to where Todd ultimately goes to uh, ends up going to uh, Erica and ultimately asking like, "Hey, could we have you have us a child?" And Erica goes, "No, like there's no way." So we end up having it to where seemingly months have passed, and we see a very just completely shut off, completely just glazed over Todd that ultimately has grown so much hair and is just in a robe and disheveled and whatever. Ultimately, he has grown attached to toy trains, and so he's built all kinds of trains all over the entire building complex, whatever. And we end up having it to ultimately like Todd is basically just a zombie walking around. Um, we end up having it to where eventually that we end up finding out that over time has passed. We end up finding out that Carol is with child yet again. Ultimately, we end up having it to where Carol and Phil have to break the news to everyone, and eventually that is to break also the news to Todd, and so we end up having it to ultimately Phil or Carol is hiding the fact that she is with child from Todd, and so eventually we have it to where Phil is like, maybe there's a way that ultimately I can like make it to where the sting of Carol being pregnant could be broken down to a way of which that Todd will be accepting of it. And so we end up having Phil going to Todd to ultimately tell him it's like, oh my God, thank God that you're not a father, because good God, it is such a burden to have kids. Like, man, you never sleep a wink, and like, oh, it's so hard, it's so difficult, and going on and on and on. Todd is or Tandy is whining and crying about being a father, and so we end up having to where Carol ultimately with a newspaper in front of her is to basically now mention to Tandy and Todd that she is now pregnant, for Tandy to be met with a no kind of reaction, to ultimately have it to where I guess this reaction is to get Todd to be uh, much more happy because Tandy is miserable about fatherhood. But we end up instead having Todd, who goes throughout his entire house, Godzilla style, to basically crumble and crash and to destroy every single bit of all these train things. And I'm wondering if ultimately Todd had hurt himself via doing any of these things by crushing and or taking down any numerous things of this via any of these takes. Um, I thought it was just kind of interesting to see like him Godzilla styling, crushing all these things, and so we end up having to eventually, after Todd just completely and otherwise annihilates all of these things, we eventually seemingly have it to where Todd just goes and really just ends up shaving himself, cleaning himself up, and seemingly being back to being a part of society yet again. And we end up having to where Erica ends up seeing Todd and basically saying like, you know what, how about I be like your surrogate mother, kind of thing. How about I give up this child to give to you? And ultimately, Todd is like, oh my god, this is amazing, this is awesome. And so because we end up having it to where there's also a scene where Tandy and Carol are ultimately two people that can't keep their hands off one another, and so they're going like ape crazy, and we end up having it to where they're consistently trying to produce a child, which ultimately, eventually, once they do, seemingly months later. Um, and I thought that that whole scenario was interesting. But again, where is Pamela and Glenn after the months that have passed here? Um, Are we to retie these characters back into this world? Or are we to basically say that they're dead? Like ultimately, like for me, my mind is now boggling about like whatever happened to Pam and Glenn. Did they separate from the group? Uh, what? Where is their story? What is going on with them? Um, I'm just kind of really fascinated by what is to go on with those people. But anyways, other than that, I think that is all that I had to reasonably talk about within these episodes. Yeah, I think that is about all that I had to say. So, anyways, that's it. I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.